They tried to buy from small farms, but they then applied the same system that they apply to their large suppliers, which is they say, okay, we'll buy from you at this price, but then we're going to keep lowering the price we're going to pay to you. And, year after year, these small farms are trying to scale up in order to meet their volume demands. They're trying to make it work at the lower prices just so that they can get this big contract. And at the end of the day, it falls apart because it costs more. There's a mismatch of scale, basically. These small farms are operating on really, really thin margins, and they can't sell at Walmart's prices and make a profit. They just can't. They can't a lot of times cover their costs. They're selling for less than the cost of production.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley, Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture. You just heard from Lisa Held. She's a food systems journalist and senior staff reporter for the independent and award-winning digital news site, Civil Eats. Lisa was featured in the first session of her 2024 symposium called The Chickenization of Organic. She shared some great takeaways from Walanthropy, which is her series about how Walmart and the Waltons wield unprecedented influence over food, policy, and the planet. You'll get to hear more from her about that today. If you missed our symposium and would like to watch the recordings, please know that tickets are still available. If you visit realorganicproject.org, you can watch the preview and find out all the details.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. My guest today is Lisa Held, and I first met Lisa some years back where she interviewed me, and it was, you remember that, Lisa, in the pizza joint in Brooklyn?
Oh, on the Farm Report. Was that the first time we met?
That's right.
Yeah.
And the Farm Report, it was kind of an amazing thing. You're behind a plate glass window in actually a very high quality recording studio that had really good
Roberta's.
Roberta's, that was it. Yeah, and all the people eating pizza get to watch you. Yeah.
Right.
So since then, you've been, I think, become quite an accomplished journalist, and you've written for a lot of major outlets, and now you're a senior editor at Civil Eats, which is a platform I really respect. You do tremendous work, and you do tremendous work there. So I was excited to reach out to you because of the series that you're doing on Walmart, because I thought it was so interesting. And that kind of came on the heels of a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture. So I think we'll blend those two things. But just one question. I've been interviewed by people, and then they ran this story in which I felt that they put in a lot of lies from other people, and they knew they were lies. And I said, why did you do that? And they said, we had to tell both sides. I said, but you knew they were lying. And they said, well, we're not investigative journalists. So I think you are an investigative journalist, just as Peter Wiersky at the Washington Post is an investigative journalist, and you're looking for the truth.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, good. So.
Yeah, I think that's a lazy excuse. I don't understand that explanation, kind of reporting a lie for the sake of balance. I think as a journalist, your responsibility is to always ask for the other perspective, ask somebody that you are, accusing or kind of saying that something about to defend their position and what their perspective is. But if something is a lie, you don't print it. There's kind of this really amazing lesson that is taught in journalism, which is, if it's raining outside and you ask two people, is it raining? And one says yes and one says no, it's your responsibility is not to print, well, she said it was raining and he said it wasn't raining. It's to look outside and see, is it raining or not?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Figure out which one of those is true. And you might still say, this person said it wasn't raining, but then you also have to say, but we checked and it was.
Yeah. Well, we face pretty complicated issues in our food system right now. And I have really been impressed by your very balanced approach to the truth. And, I think the Walmart story, the last one, was very impressive in taking a very complicated subject. And
Thank you.
Not throwing rocks, just going, isn't this odd? Look at this. And, this juxtaposition of these two almost colliding perspectives from the same group. So let's talk about that. We'll get, maybe, I think we will get to the regenerative organic discussion a little later on, but let's start with, I think it was called Walanthropy, and I sometimes talk about Walganic, because Walmart is the biggest vendor of organic food in the world as a retail outlet, and which is an amazing thing, really. Right. And how much of America's food gets bought at a Walmart?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons we wanted to do this series, because of the scale of purchasing that happens at Walmart. And there's, depending on the estimate, at this point, it's about either 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 grocery dollars are spent at Walmart in the U.S. And I mean, that's a staggering number for one company to control that big of a slice of Americans' grocery purchasing. So that was really a big piece of why we started this series, because, if all this money is being spent on groceries at Walmart, that just gives them incredible control over the American food system. And we wanted to know, what does that mean, right?
Yeah, right. What does it mean? So let me say that one of the things that we know, and some people have said to me, yeah, but this is an incredible thing for people of low income. They can get food. And other people have said to me, even here in rural Georgia, we can get organic food at the store, the same food that they get in California, which is true, that if you're in a Walmart in California or one in Georgia, it probably is the same organic. So that's a plus, that people can afford to get food. Why is it a little more complicated than that?
It's a lot more complicated than that. And it is a real factor that is important to consider, that, at this point in time, a lot of people who are low income are getting their food at Walmart, and it is the best source in their area for affordable food. And I think it's complicated for a couple reasons. First of all, I would ask, your example in rural Georgia, like, what was there before the Walmart? So, maybe now it's the source of affordable food, but what was destroyed before? What happened? Why is it the only source of affordable food in that region? And some of the very complicated factors leading up to Walmart being kind of that sole source, might include small grocers being run out of business, and small farms that were selling to their communities not being able to hang on anymore because they can't compete. And so that's one piece of it, and that's a huge, we could talk about that one aspect for a long time. And then the other big piece is, the reason that Walmart is able to sell at those prices is not because they're just nicer than every other grocery store, right? Like you and I know that in order to drive prices down, you have to cut somewhere, especially if at the end of the day, you're also making record profits. So why are those prices low? And a lot of times the answer is that the same people who are now, needing to access cheaper groceries because they are low income are in some way impacted by this driving down of prices. So maybe they work at a company that is a Walmart supplier, and Walmart pushed the prices down, and so the wages they're being paid are very, very low. Maybe they work at Walmart. I mean, Walmart, there's been a lot of reporting before mine on how Walmart, at various points in time, has been one of the biggest employers of people who access SNAP benefits. So, their taxpayers are actually subsidizing their low wages, and then those people need to purchase their food at Walmart in a lot of cases. A lot of the impacts from their supply chain, which I start to get into in my story, could also be impacting people in, for instance, in the food supply chain. If it's super cheap food, some of those impacts are being felt environmentally in communities. Maybe, people live near feedlots and they're sick and they have healthcare bills that they have to pay. So there's all these ways that prices are driven down in supply chains that impact low income people. And so it's just a lot more complicated than, they sell it cheaper, and so that's a good thing, right?
Yeah. There's an idea that they sell it cheaper because they're more efficient. But I actually...
It's part of it. It's definitely part of it.
It's part of it. But I read an interesting thing that when Walmart opens up a new store in a neighborhood, poverty increases in that neighborhood, in that community. And I didn't know that, but that's very interesting when you think about it, because it's a big new employer coming into town.
Yeah, I don't know exactly the study that you're talking about. That wasn't part of my my reporting. So I can't speak directly to that. But I know there has been over the years kind of mixed results on that there's been a lot of people who have looked at the impact on different communities, and I think it varies, but it's definitely more complicated than they come in, they hire people, and that's good for the town,
Right. So as a supplier, if my little farm was going to try and sell to Walmart, what do you think that would look like?
Based on my reporting, there really aren't any small farms selling to Walmart. They, over the years, have tried to do that because of criticism that they've gotten, around, in the early 2000s, there was kind of this shift where, they realized they were getting criticized on a lot of fronts about their sourcing and their supply chains for some of these reasons you and I are talking about. And they started to make kind of commitments and set goals around improving their supply chains. And one of those goals was buy from small farms and not just from these larger consolidated suppliers. And one thing that my reporting really showed is that's just, unless Walmart were willing to kind of fundamentally change the economics of its business, which it might be willing to do, I don't know, but they wouldn't talk to me, so I can't, the evidence I found is that they haven't been willing to do that, as far as I know. But they tried to buy from small farms, but they then applied the same system that they apply to their large suppliers, which is they say, okay, we'll buy from you at this price, but then we're going to keep lowering the price we're going to pay to you. And, year after year, these small farms are trying to scale up in order to meet their volume demands. They're trying to make it work at the lower prices just so that they can get this big contract. And at the end of the day, it falls apart because it costs more. There's a mismatch of scale, basically. These small farms are operating on really, really thin margins, and they can't sell at Walmart's prices and make a profit. They just can't. They can't a lot of times cover their costs. They're selling for less than the cost of production. So, Walmart tried to do kind of local food. They called it heritage agriculture for a few years. And then it just kind of faded away. It was sort of we tried this. They didn't say anything about it failing. It just kind of disappeared. If you find old news stories about it and you click the links to the website, they're just broken and they don't exist anymore. And so a lot of companies do this. They make big kind of announcements and try these things. And if they don't work, they just kind of, quietly let it fade, to try to, not have it stamped as a failure. But it seems based on my reporting that there was just a mismatch of scale, and they can't, if they want to sell at prices that low and they're only going to pay prices that low for that food, then it's never going to be enough for a small farm working on those margins, you know?
Yeah. And I would suggest that the quality of the food will be different too. I think potentially better from the small farm, but maybe that system doesn't have any way to recognize that or acknowledge it.
Yeah, it doesn't really. I guess they could charge a little bit of a premium for local at Walmart, but it would still be, that premium, I think, wouldn't be enough to acknowledge the difference and actually make it work for the farmer. And I should say, I mean, I think you know this better than I do, but a lot of small farms really can't access grocery markets at all anymore. It's not just Walmart. It's, any of the big retailers and grocers. It's very hard for them to establish localized supply chains. And part of it is because of the power of Walmart, because all the other retail chains are also competing with Walmart. So they're, driving their prices down as well.
Yeah, that's just what I've seen, actually. We used to sell to most of the chains in New England. We sold to Stop and Shop and Hannaford and Shaw's and Wegmans. And most of those have left us, and they mostly have left us because they've been bought up by a bigger super chain. Stop and Shop's owned by Ahold, and Hannaford's is owned by Ahold, and Shaw's is owned by Kroger's, Albertsons. So it's been amazing to see that we're now dealing with basically, and of course Whole Foods was bought by Amazon. We're basically dealing with 3 companies for and Walmart and Trader Joe's. So yeah, okay, more like 6 companies for all of New England. And almost none of them are actually willing to buy locally. And that's a big change from 10 years ago. It really is a big change.
Yeah.
And I actually think you're right, that I think it's because of Walmart. It's not that Walmart said, oh, we want to wipe out local agriculture. It's just they said we want to provide the cheapest possible food that we can on the shelves. And they did that, and they were they're very good in their supply chain. And the people competing with them said, oh my God, we've got to do that too. And so, Whole Foods is now competing with Walmart head on. And
right.
The local co-ops are competing with Whole Foods. So everything gets dragged down.
Exactly. There's like a domino effect.
So should this concern us? Right? It's a really interesting thing. If Walmart is 30% of the groceries in America right now, would it be a bad thing if it became 50%?
I mean, I guess it depends on your perspective. I mean, if you think that a more resilient food system involves kind of thriving small family farms, then it would be a bad thing, because I do think as it gets a higher proportion of grocery share, it seems like we'll have less and less of that. Consolidation in general at the top in retail and in processing, it does tend to just squeeze in especially sort of that mid-scale farm. There's always going to be the very, very small local farms that just sell to their neighbors and do okay, and then there's the big, but all the stuff in the middle, that's kind of people really making a living and being able to produce food in really environmentally friendly ways. I think we're going to have less and less of them. And I guess, if they have more of the grocery market, it might, I was going to say it might, maybe you could make a case that it would be good because there'd be more affordable food for people. But I actually started to correct myself, because there is a lot of research on the fact that more grocery consolidation in the long run actually often raises prices for consumers, because if there's just less competition, eventually companies can start to, raise their prices and because they have fewer and fewer people to compete with. So yeah, I do think, I think in general, like as a, how should I say this? I think in general, diversity is a good thing. And that's like, it almost applies to everything, right? Like diversity in, like in soil, that you need a diverse number of organisms. In markets, it's a good thing. It just, any sort of system in the world that starts to become really concentrated and not have any diversity becomes less resilient. And so I do think if we're just thinking about the future and having a resilient food system in the face of climate change and all of these other challenges that we face, that, yeah, consolidation and a kind of further lack of diversity is concerning for Americans and people around the world.
Yeah. In one of the articles that you wrote, and then I read one that you linked to, and it was about monopoly and monopsony. That was a new word for me.
Yeah.
Could you explain what a monopsony is?
It's sort of having a one very powerful buyer instead of one very powerful seller, which is a monopoly, right? So you can either control buying or selling, and Walmart is just kind of creating a monopsony, which is just having essentially, if they're the only buyer or one of a very few, again, it's just there's no competition, there's no diversity of buyers, and so then people are either forced to farmers and other sellers are forced to either meet their demands or go out of business. Really, like there's not a lot of other. It doesn't leave a lot of space for other options. Right.
There's an interesting relationship described between monopolies and monopsonies, and that when Walmart becomes consolidated, what does that mean for the suppliers? They almost have to become consolidated to deal with such a giant.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think a lot of people, when they read this story, and some people I talk to in the reporting say, well, it's not Walmart's, like the consolidation isn't Walmart's fault. The entire food system has been moving towards a more consolidated, industrialized, scaled up model, right? And, you could point a finger at Tyson and Cargill. You could point a finger at the seed companies. There's only a few now. And so it is true that it's hard to kind of figure out which, if any one player is responsible for all of this consolidation. But it's an interesting question. It makes me think of this one interview I did in the course of this reporting that actually didn't make it into the story because we just had too much, and there's always a lot that gets cut. But I talked to this one rancher, Mike Calicrate in Colorado, and he's been an advocate for independent ranchers for a long time and getting higher prices for cattle ranchers. And he said that he had this example of a situation where he met John Tyson, the head of Tyson, in the early 2000s at a conference he was at, and he basically confronted him and said, we're suing this company you're about to buy because of the low prices that are being paid to ranchers. And John Tyson said to him, you're suing the wrong person. You should be suing Walmart, because they set the prices and we just have to basically follow them. And I thought that was really interesting. Not that I think that he's right. I just think it's interesting that there's all this consolidation and it's happening throughout, and they're kind of blaming each other for it, and I don't really know exactly, like, if you can say one is responsible for the other, or it's just been kind of over time, if you look at any of these, like I said, any of these sectors, the meatpacking companies, seed companies, retailers, it's all been kind of moving in that direction, and it all kind of, it happened at the same time. So it's hard to figure out, but, it's been moving in that direction for a very long time.
Yeah. It's so interesting. It's sort of like, well, nobody's responsible, and yet it's inexorable as it goes forward. Somebody suggested that there is a precedent for this, and it was the state-run farms in the Soviet Union, and that was this kind of incredible consolidation of agriculture where one centralized authority said this is how it's going to be. And of course, there and in China, it led to huge famine. It was not successful. I don't know that this is going to lead to huge famine, but it certainly seems out of control, and there are a lot of costs that aren't showing up at the cash register that someone's going to pay for, that they're paying for. We're paying for it right now in terms of healthcare and water quality and air quality and communities. All these things have actual financial impacts. Is the government share any of the responsibility for this happening, in your opinion?
I mean, I think when it comes to consolidation in the food system, you could certainly point to government policies over the last 30 years that have supported a more industrialized, more consolidated system, from, crop subsidies that go to sort of the large-scale commodity farms that then feed into the commodity meat system as animal feed. You could point to, everybody always goes back to the sort of Earl Butz, like, get big or get out. And we just had Sonny Perdue actually under Trump, the ag secretary. He basically reiterated that to dairy farmers and said that's just the way it works in the U.S. You get big or you get out. And so, I do think the policies play a role. So I don't really, my focus, and I didn't get into this in the story at all, so it's definitely not my specialty, but I know there's a lot of people working on antitrust policy, and there's a lot of actually people that I spoke to for this story, but we didn't get into this, like Stacey Mitchell, who believe that the lack of antitrust enforcement by the government over the last few decades has really been a driving factor in some of this consolidation, for sure. So there's the ag policy, there's the antitrust policy, and it definitely plays a role. Again, that wasn't the focus of this particular story, but it's definitely part of it.
Yeah. Michael Pollan suggested that the policy of cheap food was a way of distracting and avoiding a lot of pushback from the fact that the living wage has not been met, that the actual wages that people are getting paid are going down and down over the last 40 years. So their buying power is much less, but if food is cheap, people don't get so upset about that. Of course, they're not happy, but we can barely even tell this. We're like the frogs in the pot. The water's getting hotter, but on any given day, it's hard to notice.
Right. That's interesting.
Yeah, I thought so too. And when people talk about organic food costing more, there's a line that goes, well, that's for elites. That's for people with money. And I found that usually the people saying that are people with money. People have a lot of money invested in a system of selling cheap food. And
I think that, that's one of my, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt
No,
you.
go.
But I agree with you. It's always people with money who say that. And I think it's a really condescending take, to be honest, because, who are we to assume that low-income people don't want to eat healthy organic food? I mean, I think that's kind of of course, there's a lot of people who cannot afford it because it does cost more. But to put that as a reason, like, I would argue that if organic food is healthier and better for the earth, then like, shouldn't that be accessible to everyone? And it's a very weird assumption that, well, you know, we should produce unhealthy food cheaper so that we can, you know, give it to people who can't afford anything else. Like that, it's a very, it's a little bit of a condescending perspective, I think.
Yeah.
And you know, I grew up in a family, just on a personal level. I don't think I knew the word organic growing up, but, we grew organic food. My mom grew it, because we didn't have money. And, you know, she grew all of our produce. And, you know, there's a lot of privilege involved in the fact that, you know, we were not in a city, we were in the country where we had a backyard that you could turn into a big garden. And, there's just a lot of, that was an interesting line of thinking that I had to confront when I first started covering this, because I was like, like growing up, my mom was always like, we got to grow our food because it's cheaper to do it this way. And wouldn't buy, like she would have never dreamed of buying an input because that's expensive, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's for a minute go to the other side of this equation, which is the amazing philanthropy of the Waltons, and explicitly their philanthropy to support regenerative agriculture. And you had comments that you quoted in your article about how critically important it was to adopt and build and develop an agriculture that cared about the soil, that sequestered carbon, that resulted in clean water, that, you know, had clean air, all of the things actually that organic agriculture does. And let's call it real regenerative also does. And isn't there a funny juxtaposition here of the people who are most responsible for pushing the price of food down to where the only possible thing is an industrial model, also advocating and putting their money where their mouth is, close to $1 billion into philanthropy for the alternative?
Yeah, I find kind of this line of questioning really interesting. So, you know, the story that I wrote, it really is about kind of three overlapping things, which is like, one was Walmart's regenerative claims and what the company is selling and their impact on the food system. And then is this philanthropy that's going towards regenerative agriculture. And then like the intersection, right? Like what do these things mean together? Because at the end of the day, you know, Walmart and all of the Walton philanthropies, the biggest of which is the Walton Family Foundation, they want to say, they do say that they're completely unrelated, and, you know, separate entities, and they have nothing to do with each other. But, you know, the money that is being used, that is being put into the food system now to make these improvements, is the money that was made, as profit from these systems we're talking about, right? So it's the same money. And so to me, that's a really interesting, place to start. And I like, one thing that really struck me at the beginning of this was, the Walton Family Foundation director had, gone on a trip to Iowa, to see one of their grant projects where they were doing really, really cool work, helping farmers plant native prairie strips and, cover crops and other conservation practices. And she had this quote in the blog post about, you know, the relentless demand for increased production and higher crop yields has come with a high cost, degraded soil health and lower water quality. And so you know, what she was saying is we're here to kind of help fix that. But, you know, in my mind, like the first question I have then is, but wait a minute, where did that relentless demand come from, right? And one of the places it came from was Walmart. And so it starts to like hurt your head a little bit. Well, so now this same money is being used to kind of clean up, this, mess that the company's supply chains were a part of creating. And so it's like, well, in the moment, is it better that field now has native prairie strips? Yes, absolutely. But is this like how we want our systems to work? That we just kind of create systems that cause environmental degradation and then we fix it later? Or should we just create systems that don't create that degradation in the first place, right? So it's a lot of my reporting and questions were kind of around that intersection and how to make sense out of it. And I will say, I really wish that someone from any of the Waltons would have talked to me. They have a long history of just staying very silent, and nobody would talk to me and answer questions about these kind of juxtapositions or if they see them as at odds with each other. And that's really frustrating because I want to know like how they're thinking about this. But at the end of the day, they won't talk about it. And so what I'm left with is just kind of trying to figure out the impacts by kind of reporting around and just putting on the page what I can find out about the impacts the investments are having as well, or the philanthropy is having alongside the impact the supply chain is having, and like can we measure them against each other,
Yeah. I think it's one of the big questions that we face. Honestly, we're in a tight spot on many issues with climate being in the center, but the Mississippi River, the water is killing people, and that's from agriculture, and that's from bad industrial agriculture. And it's not just killing people, it's killing fish, it's killing the Gulf of Mexico. We know over and over and over, California is turning into a desert. We know that the way that we're doing things is problematic, and perhaps fatally so. I mean, seriously problematic, not just a little oopsie daisy. And I think the question that I see so many people have is, well, surely we need to work with the giants in the industries to change this, because what we do doesn't have much impact. And we see Rodale is working with Cargill on 100,000 acres to take organic. And, good people are working with Walmart to try and help them to do a better job. And I think it's very tempting to just go, oh, those are bad people, right? But I think the reality is that we're all stuck in a bit of a tragic situation that we're trying to figure out. I'm sure the Waltons are trying to figure it out too. I understand that they just got born and here they own this empire. And if the empire doesn't play by its own rules, maybe it collapses. They've created these rules, they've led the charge, but nonetheless, I don't know that Walmart can change Walmart and say, we're going to charge more for food because we know that good food costs more.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting question. Can it exist? And that's what's interesting about this idea that they declared, they're going to become a regenerative company, because that's where you start to ask, like, is that like you just said, is it possible for them to fundamentally change would they have to fundamentally change the business model in order to really make that claim? And would they be willing to do that? I don't know. And it doesn't seem like they're taking steps in that direction based on what's happened so far, right? It's just these little tweaks. And but I mean, it's interesting because some people, I interviewed, for instance, Glenn Hurwitz at Mighty Earth, he had a lot to say about, well, they do just as we're talking about all this power that Walmart has in the food system, because they're such a massive buyer, now they're in this place where they could use that power differently. And, he said, if, Walmart said to Cargill tomorrow, unless you can show us on paper that, starting next year, there's no deforestation in any of your supply chains, we're going to pull the meat from our shelves. he said, I don't know if this is true, but he said, Cargill would do it tomorrow. If they're that big of a buyer that they have some power to exert in the supply chain. And, so far that's not the path that they've taken. The path they've taken is kind of asking their suppliers to do better and having voluntary, they have this project, and it's voluntary reporting of, ways that their suppliers are doing a little bit better in their supply chains. But they're not really requiring anything of suppliers, or they're not drawing any lines in the sand. Glenn at Mighty Earth would say they could. Other people will say they can't do that because to sell at that volume, they wouldn't have anything, they wouldn't have enough to sell, right? Because it just wouldn't exist. So yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated. There is a certain kind of hypnosis that happens, self-hypnosis, where we think, well, this is the way things are. So if these big companies weren't so big, we'd all starve to death. And I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that's true. I think a lot of the world feeds itself on very small farms. And we see that small farms can be very productive and perhaps more productive in terms of actually getting the food into somebody's mouth. With these big distribution chains, there's still a lot of waste and a lot of stuff that goes wrong.
Yeah. And 30 years ago, Walmart was barely selling food. It is really a new, you're right. It's almost like you think like, oh, this is just the way things are. And how could it be any different? But these systems are actually fairly new and didn't exist, just 4 decades ago. So it's not, I think they're not as entrenched as it can feel. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And it's amazing. In my lifetime, when I was born, Walmart didn't exist. Right. It wasn't even 2 stores. So, a lot has happened in those years, and it could be quite different in another 70 years. And we're not sure how that will be. We're sure it will be quite different. So let me ask the question that the symposium will be about. We've been inspired by Zephyr Teachout's book, Break 'em Up. And I don't know if you've ever read that book.
I haven't.
She does great work. She worked earlier with Lena Khan, and they're working on antitrust work.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lena Khan, who's now head of the FTC, Federal Trade Commission. So the vision is actually, there's a long tradition of this in America, that we shouldn't have too much centralization of power in too few hands. And we can pass laws, and we did pass laws to prevent that. And it wasn't based on the price going up to consumers. It was based on keeping democracy viable for citizens. And knowing that when too much power is in too few hands, they control the government rather than the other way around, that there's no ability to actually regulate them. I don't think the federal government can do a whole lot with Walmart or even with Amazon. So the question is, do you think that there's truth in that by reducing the potential size of companies, a lot of things suddenly change for the better?
That's a really hard question. I think, I guess what I'll say is that I've been reporting on the food system for about a decade, and all the places I have gone where I've observed people, the environment, communities thriving, have been places that are centered around regional, smaller agricultural systems. And I have yet to see an example of I'm open. Like I report, talk to really smart people who say, well, if we, scale is good because we can help so many more people. And if we change the way we farm on, every acre of commodity corn in this country, that's going to have a much bigger impact than, creating a few more small organic farms. And I'm sympathetic to that argument. I think it's smart and I understand it, but I've never seen a system. I have yet to see evidence of a place where consolidated industrial agriculture and then that then, kind of channels into consolidated retail has really created a thriving environment where the people involved in the system are doing great, are eating healthy food, making good money, living lives that they're happy with, and the environment is doing okay. I don't see the evidence. And so I guess I do think so far, from what I've seen on paper, it seems like the less consolidation there is, and the more that, the more we can do to support small, mid-sized farms and regional systems, and not just regional, maybe, also just farming, that reflects the place more, putting farms where it makes sense from an environmental perspective, maybe not doing giant dairies in California where we need water, things like that. I do think the argument is just better there. So I at this point, I think less consolidation would be better for people in the country.
There was, I don't know if you ever heard of the Goldschmidt thesis, but a guy named Goldschmidt worked for the government and did studies of this in California back in maybe the 20s and 30s. And he compared two communities that were very similar. And one was completely surrounded by very large farms, and one was completely surrounded by family farms, and looked at the impact on the towns. And let's just say everybody wanted to live in the one surrounded by family farms. All the metrics that we would have of good community, of libraries, of nice schools, of, let's say, humane policing, all of those things, lower crime rate, all those things were better. And the one surrounded by industrial farms was like Back to the Future, where you go to the town that's been destroyed by evil greed. And I mean, this is just the study, and it was very interesting. There's a guy I interviewed named Tim Wise. I don't know have you encountered Tim?
Yeah, I know him.
Yeah, he's great. And he did a study or quoted a study that was done in Africa, looking at the impact of the Gates Foundation's Green Revolution that they were taking there. And the results were interesting, which was by their own metrics, by their own goals of reducing poverty and reducing hunger. Every place that they did a big project, those things got worse, not better.
Yeah, I did see that.
Yeah. So, case in point of what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and it just, I've been on the ground in towns in Iowa where, that are just completely, filled with, pork CAFOs that feed into places like Walmart and other big retailers. I've been on the ground on the Eastern Shore where the, commodity poultry industry is really concentrated. And then I've also, I've been on so many farms in, small farms that are thriving in Maryland, New York, all over. And it's just, from a human perspective, when you see communities, like you said, it's just I've never been to a town that is, an no one has been able to show me an example of a place that is thriving because of this industrial system. It's I'm open to it. If you can show it to me, and but I don't know that it exists.
Yeah. Paul Holmbeck says organic solves problems, and these are the problems that he's talking about, the problems of clean water and clean air and a thriving community. All these things are actually, that there are real measurable benefits of having an organic base instead of an industrial base. And it's important to remember that organic actually works, that it works biologically, but that it also works on a human level for serving our communities and giving us good food. And it's so easy to get lost in this. And we confuse good food with cheap food. So before we leave, is there anything you'd like to say about that collision between that Walanthropy and the Walmart empire? Is there any lessons that you've learned or questions that you've come away with?
I think let me think about that. I think like at this point in time, it's just hard to know what the impact of all of this Walton family money will be. And, because, we've only, in this interview, we only really mentioned the Walton Family Foundation. There's also, Lucas Walton has Builders Vision, which has a philanthropic arm called Builders Initiative. And then he also has S2G Ventures, which is an investment firm that puts money into companies that might even include some real organic farms. Like he's funding things like Maple Hill Creamery in the Northeast and other organic businesses. And some of his philanthropy is he did a project, for instance, that mapped the locations of CAFOs. His work is really interesting. And I think like what's interesting, the question that just I will just continue to ask, I think, as we continue to follow this is like, how does that kind of compare to the impact of Walmart supply chains? And I don't have the answer. And I think like, I from the reporting I was able to do, like I said, nobody would talk to me within Walmart or these foundations. I got one interview with someone at Builders Vision at Lucas Walton's office, and she was an executive there, and she said this thing that really stuck with me, which was, I basically asked her this question, like, well, given Walmart supply chains are putting all this money into kind of the cheapest food possible, and you all are putting money into a very different method of producing food over here, like what about that interaction? How do you think about that? And she said, well, we hope that I'm paraphrasing, but she said something like, well, we're going to help all these companies succeed, and we're going to change agriculture, and a rising tide lifts all boats. Like, then maybe those companies will be able to be sold at Walmart, sell their products at Walmart because we're helping them make it. But I guess my understanding, based on all the reporting I've done over the years, is that I don't see that happening. I think that the two things, like from an economic perspective, are fundamentally at odds. And so I don't know like how it all shakes out in the end, unless Walmart really fundamentally changes the way it thinks about its sourcing. So I guess we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And the more that we see some branch of that family trying to support good agriculture, that's got to be a good thing. But we just can't be confused by it to go, to understand that Walmart remains a huge problem for all of us.
Yeah. And I sorry, one more thing we didn't talk about, Dave, that I think is really relevant to the Real Organic Project is just this idea of like the defining of regenerative. I think it is a very kind of fraught moment where that term is being used to describe a lot of different things. And obviously we have regenerative organic that a lot of people think that regenerative only really applies to farms that start with a base of organic. And then, I was at the Aim for Climate Summit with the USDA earlier this year, and the companies using the term regenerative, were Pepsi and Syngenta, and they're obviously talking about a very different vision for regenerative. And I think that Walmart and the philanthropy are kind of wrapped up in the middle of all of it, and they're not really like taking any action at this point in terms of like what becomes the accepted definition of regenerative, but it's certainly going to impact how people think about regenerative if if they start calling things on their shelves regenerative, or they keep putting money into projects that kind of define it one way or the other. It's going to have a big impact, and I think that will impact the ability of small farms and other people trying to define it in different ways. And so that's just something I think that's important to pay attention to going forward.
Yeah, I actually think that that bull has left the barn. It's not a conversation between the small regenerative farmers and Pepsi and Syngenta. It's not a conversation.
There's just two totally different
yes, and one side has this
definitions.
tiny little microphone that the other side encourages. Oh yeah, let's amplify that, because we love that people think that that's what we mean when we say regenerative, but it isn't. So, I see a thing in which these kind of huge hulking Godzillas are coming in and saying, we're in the picture together. And I actually think that the regenerative pioneers who believe very much in what I would call real regenerative are so pleased to see all this attention. And I'm going, no, don't you see what's happening? You are going to lose this label as meaning anything you want it to mean faster than you can imagine. So,
Right.
What happens next doesn't seem to me to be like a mystery. I think that there will be some good. Tom Vilsack just gave $3 billion to companies like Bayer and the Iowa pork growers and all of that in order to promote climate smart agriculture. I believe some good will come of that, but in the process they will destroy regenerative, and they're also destroying organic in the same process. Linley said when she goes to Washington and talks to people in Congress, they say, well, organic is not climate smart because you till. And they don't know what they're talking about,
Yeah.
But they've read something.
I will say, Dave, like one of the things that I really noticed this in the last year and couple of years is that in the policy conversations in DC around climate, organic is really absent. It's not there at all. Like that Aim for Climate Summit, I was really shocked by the fact that organic didn't even have really a seat at the table. There was almost no representation, and just an observation for you.
No, I know, and it's not a mistake. It's not accidental. Tom Vilsack went and spoke to the Organic Trade Association just before that conference.
I was there too. I was at both.
Yeah. So I think he was like buying a little piece, saying, well, no, you guys didn't get invited to the big kids table, but I love you too.
That's exactly what it felt like being there. It was like kind of like, all right, well, I'll go kind of, make these people happy over here and make them feel like they're important, but then I'm going to go over here and hand out the real money. And it's a little shocking to me. I think, probably 5 years ago, I would have thought that organic would have been kind of leading the sort of climate ag conversations, and that really hasn't been what has happened in these policy circles.
Yeah, no. Well, there's so much more to talk about, but let's just step on to, before we go, the Farm to Fork initiative in the EU, because it's very relevant to everything that we were just saying. and I know that you follow it and are aware of it. It's a very aspirational initiative, reducing chemical inputs by 50% by 2030, increasing organic certified farmland to 25% of the farmland by 2030. Do you think that's a positive direction?
Well, I don't really, to be honest, I don't know a ton about what's happening in Europe because my focus is so much on the American food system. Mainly what I know about farm to fork is that American policymakers have rejected it kind of based on what we were just talking about. I was, kind of shocked that by the kind of animosity towards farm to fork from Vilsack and other policymakers. But I think based on the research, increasing organic farmland, I could see no downside to that. And, some people will say, oh, well, the yields are not as high and there's all, but I did a story a few years ago on organic and climate, and I went into it with a very, kind of like thinking about those ideas that people always kind of criticize organic for not having yields that are high enough to make up the difference, and I was like really, really struck by all the research on organic and how much better it performs on all these metrics related to climate. And I think the headline of the story, it was literally like something like, "Is organic good for the climate?" or something. It's an old Civil League story from a couple of years ago, but I just was struck by how clear the research was. I really went in, kind of ready to say like, okay, if it doesn't, we can say organic, we know that like having less pesticide in the environment is a good thing, and soil, better soil health is a good thing, but we might not be able to say that it's better for climate. But I mean, the research that was in front of me seemed very clear. So I think it's probably a good thing that the EU is trying to shift that way. And I am not sure why. Well, I am sure I know why in the US that isn't happening, and it's because the companies that have the power are not behind organic, right? And so, yeah, and I mean, like reducing pesticide use, yeah, like what's the target in farm to fork?
25% of the land certified organic and a 50% reduction of chemical inputs to agriculture.
I mean, 50% reduction in chemical inputs, yeah, there's no doubt that would be transformative. I mean, nitrogen, fertilizer, if that includes fertilizer, I mean, fertilizer use in terms of nitrous oxide emissions is just so huge, and nitrogen getting into waterways. I mean, the climate and water impact that would have would be massive. And I honestly, like, I know we're trying to finish up, but I will say, like, one of the things that I'm most focused on as a reporter at this point is the impacts of pesticides. And I think, there's a huge focus on climate impact right now for very good reason, because it is an emergency and we are hurtling towards a cliff that is very scary. And I really understand kind of the urgency and around climate, and we're not moving fast enough to reduce emissions in all sectors. But I do feel like there's this kind of willingness that is scary to kind of put that ahead of any other impact. And pesticides are one of these things that is kind of, the impacts of pesticides, I think, is getting lost in this kind of like race to make everything climate friendly. And, at the end of the day, we could reduce emissions, but if we're just increasing pesticide use, we're not going to have any biodiversity. And, it's just as dire. The end result is just as terrifying, having literally, just biodiversity collapse. And some of the research on that is really what keeps me up at night. And, I'm doing a ton of reporting on neonicotinoids, and I mean, the EU is so ahead of the US, right? On that front, they've banned a lot of the ones that we're using here. And we just continue to just plant them across like basically all of our commodity cropland, these treated seeds. And it is a devastating problem. And I think we haven't even begun to see the impacts, because it's just now that people are even realizing, oh, we've been coating these seeds on every single acre of commodity cropland across the country, and 98% of that is getting into the environment. It's really terrifying. So I think any way that we can move away from those inputs it's going to benefit people in numerous ways, and it's really necessary.
Absolutely. Just to speak personally for a moment, I have 3 nephews who have gotten cancer young, and one of them is in the buyout from Bayer for the glyphosate lawsuit, and
Wow.
He's got that cancer, and he did apply glyphosate. So, absolutely, there are all these devastating end of the world collapse of biodiversity, which is almost harder for people to wrap their head around than climate change now. I think they don't quite get, aren't insects sort of a problem? And, that what does that mean when we so dramatically reduce our communities? But before we go, let me just give you one last chance. Is there anything you'd like to say? Because you've got a lot of things you work on, and I really respect it, that you'd like to just mention before we go?
No, I think we really, we covered so much, and yeah, you just kind of let me go off on the importance of, of paying attention to the impacts of pesticides. And I think, that's definitely going to be my focus, a focus of a lot of my reporting going forward, because I do think that, it's really one of the most pressing issues that doesn't get enough attention in mainstream press. So, I guess I just look out for more of that.
Yeah, great. Well, let me call out to everybody who is listening or watching. Please check out Civil Eats and subscribe to it and donate to it and support their work. Lisa, you're one of the more respected investigative journalists in America. So I really appreciate the work you're doing. And thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. Our movement is growing because you're subscribing and sharing these podcasts with your friends. So keep it up and leave us a rating and a review as well so that others can find us. You can find a video version of this interview on our newly designed website, realorganicproject.org, or on our YouTube channel. And you can join us every Thursday for a new episode featuring voices from the organic movement. See you next time.